Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our latest virtual student event in partnership with BPP University Law School. I'm Erin Williams. I'm an events coordinator here at Legal Cheek, and I'm thrilled to announce this afternoon's session, which is the latest in a series of virtual events we're running in partnership with BPP, which explore everything to do with the SQE. In previous sessions, we've spoken about the SQE, a wide variety of SQE related topics, and you can find recordings of these sessions on our website. In addition to this, we've recently curated a list of the most frequently asked questions from students attending these events, with answers written by BPP SQE experts, which can be found on our new SQE facts page. And one of my colleagues will put a link to that page in the chat in just a moment. In today's session, we're delving into SQE2 specifically, and the session will be chaired by Johnny Hurst, who is BPP's Head of Outreach. Johnny will be joined by Laura Baines, who is the SQE2 Award Leader at BPP, as well as Madeline, Jasmine and Daria, who are all BPP SQE students, and they will all share a little bit more information about themselves during today's panel discussion. Before I hand over to Johnny, I just want to do a quick bit of housekeeping. So during the panel discussion, you can put any questions you may have in the chat tab, which you can find on the right-hand side of your screen. Today's panel discussion will be taking place from 4 p.m. until just after 5 p.m. and will be followed by an hour of virtual networking with the BPP University Law School team. Don't worry if we don't get to answer your questions during the first half of the event, as there will be plenty of opportunities during the networking. Please also do make sure that you've got your chat set to stage as a post-event so we can see all your questions coming through. And at 5 p.m, I will pop back up on screen and direct you all to the virtual networking session. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Johnny for this afternoon's session.
Thank you so much, Erin, and it's great to see so many people in the room at the moment, and we've got a fantastic panel for you. We've got some slides that will come up onto the screen in a moment, I'm sure. But just before we get going, I'll just introduce myself. I'm Johnny Hurst, used to be a partner in a city law firm. I've been at BPP for some time now, where I now run our outreach, used to be head of faculty for the LPC back in the day, but now really focused on SQE. So that's who I am. I'll ask my colleague Laura to introduce herself, and then I'll get our three students to introduce themselves as well.
Hello, hi everyone, good afternoon. My name's Laura Baines. I'm the award leader for SQE2 here at BPP. So I focus on students carrying out the skills portion of the SQE exams. My background is as a skills tutor, and I still get into the classroom as well.
Fabulous. Jasmine.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jasmine Sayani. I came into this through the sort of non-law route. So I did my undergrad at Bristol in philosophy and theology, and then a master's in Edinburgh in theology. Then did my law conversion with BPP, and now I'm doing my SQE in the second term. And I also work part-time as a paralegal at Wimbledon Dickinson. And I've got my training contract starting in September at Watson Farley & Williams.
Great stuff. Madeline, slightly different route, but I'm sure you can share it with us.
Yeah, I'm Maddie. I'm a future trainee at Adelshaw Goddard. I'm also from a non-law background. I did a history undergrad at the University of Manchester. Then I did the GDL at BPP back in 2020. Took a gap year, did a ski season, and then now I'm back doing the SQE. Sat the SQE1 in January, and I'm currently doing SQE2 with BPP at the moment.
Fabulous. And finally, Daria.
So my name's Daria. Unlike Jasmine and Madeline, I did do a law degree. I did my LLB at Glasgow and I graduated just last year. I'm unsponsored. Unfortunately, I don't have a training contract, so I chose to do the course specifically with BPP, and I started the SQE LLM in September of last year.
And I think I'm right in saying you've all done SQE1 and you're waiting for your results for SQE1. that will come through next week. So let's just pass on that for the moment, because I'm sure there are other times you can be thinking about that. But thank you so much for joining us today. So what we've got for you, everybody, is a set of slides with a lot of your fantastic questions that you sent us in advance that we've put into a slide deck, and with a few things to prompt us to talk about our deep dive into the SQE2 assessments. But I think it would be wrong for us to go and dive straight into the SQE2 assessments without putting it all into context. So we are going to talk about what SQE2 is, but tell you a little bit about where that sits into the whole SQE journey. And then when we're talking about the SQE2 journey itself, we're talking about how you prepare for SQE2, the costs and accessibility issues that a number of students obviously have. We'll talk about pass rates and pass marks. We'll look at a sample question briefly and then take any questions at the end. Just a word of warning, I suspect, as Erin mentioned at the beginning, we won't be able to answer many of the questions that come up onto the chat, because the questions we've received in advance from people have been so extensive and so on the money. But as we all know, we've got that extra hour networking where all your questions pretty much can be answered. So stay on for that, particularly if you have further questions in the second hour. So I think the first thing maybe to ask Laura to do is just to give us a bit of an overview of the pathway to show where SQE2 sits in before we take our deep dive into the SQE2 syllabus and exams. So Laura, just want to walk us through the journey.
Yeah, of course. It might be becoming familiar to many of you as we're now fully into the SQE solicitor qualifying examinations regime. That's now the main route to qualification if you are looking to become a solicitor. That requires you to sit the two big parts of SQE, of the solicitors qualifying exams, which are now set by the SRA. So everybody entering the profession, whichever provider you study with, or even if you don't study at all, you complete those same exams in order to reach qualification. And you can see there we've got the number 1 and the number 2. SQE1 is the knowledge-based exams, lots of multiple choice questions that our students who are with us have just done. And then SQE2, which adds in the skills tests to test all of that knowledge in a skills-based context in order to prepare you for practice as well. We've also got in this kind of equation on the screen the other things that need to be in place in order for you to achieve your qualification. You need a degree. It no longer has to be a law degree. And if you have a non-law degree, you don't have to do a conversion course, although one would be very useful in order to get a foot into that legal knowledge before you go into SQE Part 1. You also need qualifying work experience, and we've put this after the SQE in the equation, but it could occur at any time. You've now got a really flexible regime that allows you to move between gathering work experience and taking your exams in a really fluid way. So hopefully that makes it much easier for different people to join the profession and to do those in an order that suits them. The qualifying work experience that's required is 2 years in total, but it no longer needs to be sat just with one provider, like a training contract. It could be sat at a number of different firms where you build up a portfolio of qualifying work experience that's signed off by the SRA. And then finally, hopefully it's not one that is difficult for anybody. You need to be of satisfactory character and suitability for entering the profession. So that's your whole equation that you need to achieve in order to qualify as a solicitor through the SQE route.
Brilliant. Thank you, Laura. And I think the thing to emphasize there, how fluid that journey is. One of the only conditions really is that you can't move on to SQE2 until you've passed SQE1 for people doing the whole of the SQE journey. But you can do your qualifying work experience before, during, or after, or a combination of all the above. So let us talk about what the SQE is. So we'll talk very, very briefly about SQE1, and maybe then bring our students in here. So SQE1. I think Daria, you did a law degree. Do you remember studying all those subjects that I got in white here that are on those two papers here? And then you then later studied these additional subjects as part of your SQE1 journey. And I think it's similar for Jasmine and Maddie when they did their conversion course. They did the subjects that you can see coloured in white as part of the conversion course, because they're the core foundation stuff, and then they moved on to do the more practice-based modules. Very, very briefly, because this is an SQE2 session, how was SQE1, say, compared to SQE2 in terms of your experience as an assessment and the whole regime? What were your thoughts then, Daria?
Well, of course, I haven't sat the SQE2 assessment yet. I don't think any of us have. So it's difficult to compare the actual assessment experience. But we were just talking before this call, and I think we all agree that the pressure has slightly decreased on the SQE2 part of the sort of the SQE journey, if you will, just because the foundational legal knowledge has already been covered, and it's more about the soft skills that are necessary, which tends to be something that is a bit more easily practicable, whereas knowledge has to be memorized and learned from scratch. And this tends to be a sentiment, I think, that all of our course mates share as well.
Good stuff. We'll come back to Maddie and Jasmine on another question or two, because I want to get us into SQE2 and the questions that everyone's asked in advance. So this is an overview really of what SQE2 looks like. Laura, can you just explain it in outline in terms of the assessment regime? There's quite a lot on this quite busy table. Could you sort of make sense of it in terms of how it's divided between different types of assessment?
Yeah, of course. Let me take you through. So as you can see on the very top row along the top, there's oral skills and there are written skills. You sit 4 papers in oral skills for SQE2 and 12 in the written skills. So it's a big assessment totaling 16 papers overall. The oral skills are listed in that second row. There's advocacy and client interviewing, and the written skills too are listed. Case and matter analysis. So that's the process of analysing what a client needs from you and identifying the relevant legal solution for them. Legal research, finding an answer within legal sources. Legal writing, producing an email or a letter to a client in advice. And then legal drafting, putting together legal documents, either court-facing documents or something like a contract or a lease or a will. Those are all across the top. And then you can see in the left-hand column, you've got the different legal subjects. So now grouping together into those broad areas of crime, dispute resolution, property, wills, and business, you can see how often each of the different skills are assessed in each of the different legal areas. For the oral skills, relatively self-contained, advocacy is assessed. You can see where the ticks are in crime and in dispute resolution. Client interviewing is assessed in wills and in property. And then the written skills assessed more widely. Each of the 4 skills is assessed 3 times, and you will have a number of papers across each of the top 4 knowledge areas, and all of the papers occurring in business. And that brings you to that total of 16 overall.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So quite a big regime to get prepared for, and we'll start to sort of discuss what that involves in terms of preparing for SQE2 now. So there's quite a few questions here on the board. I think if we could start off with what a version of the student from Royal Holloway's question: how many hours per week do you need to be spending maybe studying and preparing for SQE2? If you join a full-time course, how long are you spending on your preparation, I suppose, at the moment per week? Maybe we could start off with Maddie. How many hours do you devote to your studies for SQE2, do you think?
I think I'm kind of roughly treating it as a 9 to 5. We've gone from SQE1, which was really, really intense, like way more than full-time hours, in my opinion, to now having a bit more time for ourselves. So I sit down at my desk at about 9, try and like go through some old apply tasks that we've done before and kind of use them as like practical examples. And then, yeah, by 5 o'clock, I'm done. I'm having my evening to myself because I'm still trying to decompress from SQE1 in preparation for SQE2 as well.
That's good advice, but it is like a full-time job as what you say, Maddie, and that's how we design the course, I think. And maybe I could bring in Jasmine now, and if you could look at the middle question, so given that the SQE2 revolve around practical skills, what sort of lessons will SQE students engage in while studying for the exams? Well, obviously this is going to vary depending on where you actually study for your assessments, but on the BPP course, for example, how do we get you ready for the practical skills that you're going to be tested on? What's the classroom session look like?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the main thing about SQE2 is that it's really about practicing the skills just over and again. So we have lots of opportunities to practice within within the classes at BPP. And the way that it works is you normally will prepare something to sort of bring into class and then share with a peer, and then they'll kind of feedback on your work. You can discuss it, you can compare your answers with a partner, talk to the tutor to get some feedback or to ask particular questions you might have. And we also sometimes do kind of practices of the actual exams, or practices that BPP have put together, or practices that the SRA have up on their website. So sometimes we do either an entire sort of practice exam within class, or do certain aspects of it. So maybe just preparing your sort of template for a written answer. So yeah, I'd say they're really very much focused around practicing the skills.
And of course, we do something relatively unique at BPP in the sense that when it comes to SQE1, we start introducing, preparing those skills that you need to be developed early on as part of SQE1. Do you remember any of the student panelists, any of the sessions that come to mind from SQE1 where you were actually starting to develop some of the skills that you need to demonstrate in SQE2? Does any of those come to mind at all? Any of you?
I remember in like workshop 5 for business, we had to write a letter explaining like how to allot shares within a business. But I was saying like earlier, I find it really helpful now that we've kind of finished substantive teaching for the SQE2 to kind of look back over the applied tasks that we've done in SQE1 and attempt them in time conditions to try and kind of keep the momentum of practicing the skills flowing when there's not that many past papers at the moment.
And that's one of the things that unfortunately we are very much bound by, or you as students are very much bound by non-disclosure agreements when it comes to disclosing what was in any assessment, and therefore providers, we are left, all of us and prospective students, looking at the sample questions that the SRA publish on their website. So we have we've got quite a lot of experience, haven't we, Laura, in terms of knowing the sort of assessments that get set. And indeed, many of the people at Kaplan who set the exams are people who worked at BPP, so we know them very well. We know the way they think. But there is a certain amount of us having to make sure that we can second guess what the assessment's going to look like, and therefore we design that and build that into our course. Would you like to add a little bit more in terms of how we go about doing that?
I think our student panel's done justice, really. So much of it is in the skills teaching is about that active learning, having a go at these skills and repeatedly doing them in the exam environment, because it's not just learning the skills, it's learning them for these particular assessments. And I think, as Johnny says, we, and I'm sure many other providers will be doing the same, we're drawing on our years and years experience of skills teaching. We haven't taught to the SQE for decades, but we have taught legal skills to solicitors for decades, and already we're drawing on the experience that we've got now of multiple cohorts going through. We know from our results that our papers are on the mark in terms of equivalence with the SQE2 papers that the SRA are setting. And although we do only have that one single example of each of the different skills from the SRA, we are able to give lots of experience to our students, and I'm sure other providers would be in the same position. So it's really nice to hear from our students that they're being used and that they feel useful, because I think you're absolutely right. Working through these skills again and again is what develops and hones those skills, informed by everything you're learning and that feedback that you're getting through your workshops.
There's the question on the left that we haven't quite touched on, that we could touch on briefly, and maybe anyone in the panel could come up. I think just to give it some context, I think when the SRA introduced the SQE, and remember it's only a couple of years old, the SQE, their intention was that the SQE2 assessment would be the endpoint assessment after you'd finished your qualifying work experience. And it may well be that that's what some people decide to do, but it doesn't seem to be the way that the majority of students want to prepare themselves for SQE. They want to get their education out the way, most of them, before they do their qualifying work experience, or possibly whilst they're doing it alongside. And therefore the students sort of saying, well, am I at a disadvantage? I think that's what's behind the question, by not having practical legal experience going into SQE2. What do you guys feel? I mean, obviously, Jasmine, you're working in practice at the moment, so I'll disqualify you for that because you have obviously some reference points, but less so I would have thought, Daria and Maddie, how do you feel? Do you feel like you're at a disadvantage because you're not working in practice?
Go ahead.
I did paralegal for a year, but I think like my point with it was that I found the skills potentially easier than some of my cohort, just from like the softer skills I developed when I was in practice for a couple of years. But when we peer assess our answers, one of my best friends in the class, Ellie, I'm sure she won't mind me saying, like, she's never worked in practice. She's come straight from university. She's still getting like B's and A's on her like peer assessed work. So it is so like possible to do. And also the standard is like day one solicitor. It's not solicitor with 10 years of experience. Like, I think it's important to remember that the SRA aren't searching for perfection. They're just searching for like competent. So the bar is not super, super high. And I don't think it should put you off not having any practical experience at all.
Good. Daria, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I wanted to expand on the point you made about how some people choose to take on the QWE before SQE2. And I think there's advantages and disadvantages to both, because as the girls have said, you could develop those soft skills from practice, but at the same time, because the functioning legal knowledge is so vast, that carries forward from SQE1 into the SQE2 different forms of assessment, the perk to having just done SQE1 and doing this in an integrated program is that that knowledge is fresh. And also, I think the way in which the SQE2 exam is structured with these 6 specific skills isn't necessarily conclusively representative of all the skills you could ever practice as a lawyer. Some skills, depending on your paralegaling role, you would practice less or more. And so it's not necessarily the case that your work experience will be targeted to sort of succeed in these assessments, as much as it may help in a way which a structured course targeted towards the assessments will. So I think there are advantages.
Yeah, it's good. I mean, I think, and to emphasize the point, there are pros and cons here. One of the disadvantages, of course, is that the longer you leave it to start your SQE journey, the further away you are from that functioning legal knowledge that you've learned on your conversion course, your LLB. So it's you can pay your money, you take your choice, and it is something that you need to. I've just been told my microphone's slightly clipping, so I'll move it down a little. Sorry about that. Right, so let's move on to the next topic, if we can do, and it's this one. It's about let's go back, costs and accessibility. So my slides seem to be carried away with themselves. And I think we've started to talk about working alongside the course, and indeed, I think we ought to probably give the official position from the university first of all. Laura, what's our view for both SQE1 and SQE2 for people doing a full-time course?
Our advice for a full-time student is exactly in line with what Maddie said, that you will be doing 9 to 5 every day and you need those hours available. So there isn't really room for work alongside your course. If you are interested to study part-time, and again, we offer part-time, lots of other providers do, then there would be scope to work alongside. I think everything that the student panel is saying tells you that there is a real challenge in the SQE. There's an awful lot to learn, and therefore I think you just need to be cautious with any work that you took on alongside to know that you can balance the two.
Yeah, I know, Jasmine, you're doing a little bit now. How do you manage working alongside a full-time course? SQE2 is less intense, as we've heard, but there's still plenty to get through. So how do you manage your workload in that sense?
Yeah, so as everyone's been saying, the SQE1 term is certainly a lot, there's a lot more kind of content and contact hours. And yeah, it was especially difficult during the SQE1 term. I'm very fortunate to have a boss who's very flexible in terms of which hours I work which week, each week. And that helps a great deal. And then just, being really on top of things, and I guess making certain sacrifices of social events and things like that in order to make sure that I get through all of my work. So it's definitely a trade-off. I do think it's really beneficial. It's really helped me to sort of have a forum to practice the skills that I'm learning, particularly during the SQE2. But I think it really depends on the person and what you're willing to kind of trade off, and yeah, definitely something to not to do lightly, I would say.
Yeah. I think being responsible, I think the key that you've mentioned is that the flexibility you've got, that you probably do very little during SQE1 and maybe you feel it's a bit easier during SQE2, but your boss is very flexible, and it's the willingness to be flexible. And I think if ultimately finance is an issue, and it is for many students, we know that, then seriously consider the part-time course. It's not a race to qualify to be a solicitor. If it takes you another 6 months, 12 months in a 30 or 35-year career, that's nothing. It really is nothing, and it will look after your mental health and your bank balance a little bit better as well. Even if you qualified 6, 12 months further down the road, it really matters not to most people. Could I go to Laura for the second question, because we're talking about accessibility now, and I think we're not talking about SQE1, where there are obviously real issues in terms of the neurodiverse community in coping with multiple choice questions, and there are special measures that and applications can be made for due consideration and reasonable adjustments. What specifically applies to SQE2 in terms of students where they may have particular learning support or educational needs to support them with the SQE2, both for the exams but also in a preparation course like at BPP?
I suppose as far as exams go, to some extent, it's more a question for the SRA. What we know through our students is that the SRA do really thoroughly look at reasonable adjustments that can be put into place for anyone who needs to sit those assessments. And I've seen that particularly for SQE2, because the assessments are so diverse, you're sitting the oral assessments face to face with an assessor who plays your client or plays your judge. You're sitting the written assessments in a timed environment online, and you sit multiple assessments in a day. There are a lot of different adjustments that get put in place. So I think the SRA are really aiming to support students to make it possible for anybody who wants to sit these assessments to do so. In terms of kind of supporting wider diversity in the profession, we know that the SRA introduced the SQE regime with a big intention of increasing the diversity of the profession. They know that we're not as diverse as we would like to be as a profession, and they are aiming to address that. And hopefully some of that flexibility in QWE in the SQE regime allows for it. I'm not sure it's achieved what they've hoped for as yet. The SRA are monitoring though, and they produce a report after each of the sits of SQE, which documents lots of different data about the sit, but it includes diversity, and so it is something that they are looking at. My perception is that it's a work in progress rather than something that's been achieved so far, but let's hope that it's moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think there's a direct correlation between those students that are working and maybe overcommitting on the paid work at the expense of their studies. And if you look at some of the stats for people from certain social demographic groups, the implication is that a lot of these people are probably working alongside the course, and therefore it's taking them away from their studies. So it's a question of making sure that if you do have to work, you've got the bandwidth to still put as much time into your studies, or you seriously consider doing the course over a longer period and doing a part-time preparation. And that's just going to stand you in much better stead in the long run. We're now going to look at the cost for SQE, but in particular the cost of the assessments, which from a diversity perspective is something that did cause a lot of ructions. And I'm not quiet on social media about this, so I'll explain my campaign in a moment. But the centralised assessment fees, you can see for SQE1, it's just under £1,800, £900 per paper, 2,766 to sit SQE2. So it's almost getting closer to £5,000 to sit both sets of assessments. And I'll be interested to know from students how you've managed to finance this, because even if you do a master's of the course, which can fund the fees for the provider, or at least a substantial amount of them, it won't fund the centralized assessment fees. So how have you managed to get that sort of some money together, because most people don't have access to it? It may be that you have family and maybe you don't, but should we just run through the panel? Dario, from you, where's the money coming from? So the cash, because you need cash for this, that's the critical thing, rather than you can't just go and borrow it from the student loans company.
Yeah, so fortunately, I'm a Swedish citizen, and the sort of student finance agency is a bit more generous than the UK one. So for this year, I submitted my sort of acceptance documents and so on, and I got them to pay the tuition for the LLM course in full, because it falls under their sort of annual threshold that they're willing to allow. And on top of that, I'm taking both student loans, and I'm getting sort of these national student grants that we're entitled to. And that's what's sponsoring my rent and my living expenses and so on. So I realize I'm relatively lucky in that situation.
Okay, how about you then, Maddie?
Yeah, I've been quite lucky as well, to be honest. I'm a sponsored student, so Adelshaw Goddard have covered my course fees and have also given me a grant of £5,000 to live off for the year. But because I did the GDL about 3-4 years ago now, I took out the master's loan then, so I've not been able to this year, which has been really tough to like try and live off. So I've had to swallow my ego and move home as a 24-year-old woman. And yeah, just try and like scrimp as much as I can. I do work part-time in a bar, but yeah, I'm not gonna lie, it's really difficult. And yeah, I'm one of the lucky ones. So yeah.
I mean, sponsored students, they do get grants of different sizes, and obviously depending on the size of the grant gives help. But there are many students that are not sponsored, and Laura, we see many students who have to save a lot of money, or they have to borrow a lot of money on top to actually start the course, and that creates its own pressures, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It very much increases the pressure on these sits when you've handed over that money, or you've had somebody else fund it for you, and then you've got that pressure. And not to make it, put too much of a downer on things, but this is the cost per sit as well. So this assumes that you get through each of the papers at the first sitting. If you need to resit either of the SQE1 papers, or you need to resit your SQE2 sitting, you have to pay again.
Yeah, I think the only concession the SRA have made is if you pass one of the SQE1 papers, you only pay half the fee. But SQE2 is judged as a whole, it's all or nothing, and therefore you'd have to pay it again. I mean, we do offer scholarships for our students to get a reduction on fees, anything from 2,000 to full fees, and other providers offer scholarships as well. But there's no two ways about it. The SQE, if you're looking to do a really comprehensive course, which the courses tend to be about the same, if not a little bit cheaper than the old LPC courses, because you've got this centralized assessment fee on top, it does mean that students are having to find a lot of money. And a lot of people who are self-funding are just taking a little bit of time to save up the money, or doing it part-time, and I think that's very sensible. But I think the key thing is not to overcommit when you've got those sort of commitments on the line, and not to go into an exam or a course half-baked, bearing in mind what it's going to cost you to resit. Okay, let's talk about pass rates, and that was a question that came up from a student from the University of Exeter. I think one thing we can talk about is, and before we talk about the SQE2 pass rates, Laura, for SQE1, they're known to be very, very, quite low. It's almost just above 50%, but it's quite different for SQE2. Why is that?
Yeah, it's better for SQE2, which is nice news. Perhaps some of the reason is because you have to have completed SQE1 beforehand. And when SQE2 is marked, 50% of the marks available are for the skills that you demonstrate, and 50% of the marks available are for the knowledge that you demonstrate. And that knowledge comes from the SQE1 specification. So a lot of the knowledge that you're tested on in SQE1 carries across into SQE2. And so therefore, I think students come with a lot of that prepared, and that hopefully means that students are reasonably well prepared for SQE2 or for part of SQE2 before they begin. And the fact that they've passed SQE1 it demonstrates that perhaps they are suited to the SQE regime.
Great. So let's have a look at some pass rates then. So these are results from the 2023 SITs. There were the first two in 2023. The national pass rate was 77% in April. That's for all sitters. If you're a first sitter, it's slightly higher at 80%. Just to give you a comparison, BPP's students performed 20% above that, and similarly when it came to the July 23 SITs, again we were 20% above the national pass rate, and it's something that I'm very proud of Laura and her team for delivering such a great pass rate, and we're tracking very close to 100% for the October 2023 SITs. We're just collating the data now, so it does show that you do need to do your research on courses, because although we can't guarantee people to pass SQE2, we do at least give students a pretty good chance, and if they do the course, there's a very good chance that you'll pass, given those stats there. And these are stats from all cohorts. They're not just sponsored cohorts, not just full-time cohorts. These are all our cohorts we consulted who sat those assessments. So we're very proud of that, as we are for our SQE1 pass rate, which again is over 20% above the national pass rate. We'll be collecting some more data for that for the January 24 SITs when those results come up in March, but we'll just move on from that at the moment. Before we actually go on to look at the recruitment process on the slide in front of us, the pass mark varies, doesn't it, between papers, Laura? Do you want to just explain a little bit? It seems to have settled at about 61 or 62%. Why do we have a variety of pass marks?
Yeah, there's a variety of pass marks because of the nature of the skills exams. And so the SRA carry out an exercise to kind of gauge where that competency standard of a day one solicitor should sit in relation to that selection of assessment papers. And even within different SITs of SQE2, within, for example, the April SIT, different students will sit different papers depending on which day you attend or which week you attend to sit the assessment. So even within a SIT, there can be varying pass marks. The intention is to make sure that it's a fair test for everybody for whichever papers you sat.
Yeah, just to answer Liliana's question, I just flashed the SQE1 results on the screen very quickly, just because we were talking about SQE2, so I decided not to focus on it so much. But thank you for that answer. That's very comprehensive there, Laura. Let's talk about the recruitment process now. And obviously, we've got two trainees with training contracts and one who's still looking. I suppose, looking at the questions you've got on the screen there, there's a theme here, I think, in terms of, does it matter? Should you wait till you try and get a training contract before you do SQE2, because it's obviously quite a commitment. But I think it's Daria. Which course are you doing, and why did you decide to commit to SQE2 before you got a training contract?
I'm taking the full-time LLM, so I've done SQE1 already full-time, and I've just now started the SQE2 preparation course. And honestly, I think I thought it was personally a smart decision, because I knew that if I committed to the course, I would commit to continuing my applications. Whereas I felt like if I had nothing anchoring me to the solicitor route, I would sort of just float in the open, I suppose, after my LLB. And so I have in fact secured a vacation scheme for the summer, so I suppose that came into fruition to some extent. And in terms of the second part of that question about firms' views, I've attended so many firm events this year and tried to understand what their views are on people who are already undertaking the SQE or even the LPC. And I think the trend is that for the majority of firms, they aren't too concerned about whether they will be the ones to choose the institution and sponsor the student or whether the student has passed the SQE already. I think it matters more for those who have undertaken the LPC because some firms will require them then to, at the very least, sit the SQE2 exam, which, as we've just recognized, contains the SQE1 contents. So for those who've chosen to do the SQE2, the SQE in general independently, I don't think it necessarily increases or decreases your chances of securing qualifying work experience or a training contract.
Yeah, thank you. And just to emphasize the point about the LPC and the SQE, for those of you who are third years looking to start in September on either an LPC or an SQE, I would say, unless you've got an LPC training contract in the bag, commit to the SQE. And the reason for that is that you will need, if you don't get a training contract with the LPC, you will still need to pass SQE2. So you might as well take the shorter route and do SQE1 and SQE2, but the LPC is perceived to be a little easier, which I think is fair enough to say that, and the pass rates are certainly compared to SQE1 are much higher, and therefore, if you've got an LPC training contract in the bag, take it, but if you haven't, the advice is look at the SQE because that is certainly the future. Okay, we are going to look at a sample question now because we've talked about there are lots of skills involved, but I don't think we can understate the importance of that core knowledge that everyone needs when they are going into the SQE2 assessment. And that core knowledge is stuff that you learnt in your undergraduate degree and were tested on as part of your SQE1, but also all the practice stuff that you were introduced to as part of your preparation for SQE1. There is a sort of random question that's cropped up there before we look at the sample question, though. What are the common mistakes made in SQE2 assessments? That's from a student at Queen Mary. Although none of you guys have done your SQE2 assessments yet, but what you are doing is lots of practice stuff along the way. Are there any things that you've learnt along the way that you were maybe not getting right, but actually you're now able to sort of modify so that your performance improves? Is there anything, Jasmine, for example, you've identified in your own SQE2 journey so far as you get ready for the assessments?
Yeah, sure. So what really struck me is that, because obviously we've been saying that the content that's examined in the SQE2 is the same as the content, or there's no additional content from the SQE1. But what really struck me is that it's quite differently assessed, and the way that you need to think about the knowledge is very different between SQE1 and SQE2. So in SQE1, it's sort of multiple choice questions that are very sort of focused on narrow parts of legal tests and things like that. Whereas for the SQE2, you need to be thinking about kind of the bigger picture and the overall likelihood of a claim succeeding rather than one sort of individual part of it. And so I think I wasn't expecting to need to re-revise everything quite to the same extent and with a different frame of mind than actually has been the case.
Yeah, no, I think it's a fair assessment actually. So thank you for that. So let's have a look at the sample question. Maybe Laura, you can just explain a little bit about the context of. Oh, sorry, there were two other questions here. Oh, we're going to find out the answers to these questions actually when it comes to looking at the sample question. So how do the assessments simulate real life scenarios, and what do the exams entail? So we'll answer those two questions that were asked in advance. So Laura, this question can be found on the SRA's website. It might be difficult for people to see, but we'll give people a link to that. Perhaps I think you got the link earlier. If you could pop that in the chat, that'd be really helpful. But this is a question that's a wills-based question that involves three three set pieces or three different time periods within a very short space of time. So do you want to give a little bit of background to how that's how that hour and a bit is structured?
Yeah, absolutely. Jasmine just beat me to it. I was trying to share the link as well, but you're very on the ball, Jasmine. Thank you. This is the sample question from the SRA. So this is the one example that we have from the SRA of what these papers look like. And as Johnny alluded to earlier, candidates that have been through the SQE regime, whether it's SQE1 or SQE2, sign a non-disclosure agreement. So we don't know anything more about any of the other past papers that have been sat. This is our one example. And as Johnny just said as well, it's a 1 hour assessment. So there's 60 minutes for this assessment, which is relatively short. Somebody asked in advance, what are some of the challenges of these assessments? I think the timing is one of the challenges, that in all of the assessments, you're being asked to do quite a lot in quite a short space of time. The breakdown for the interview assessment, and I should give it its full title, which is Client Interview and Attendance Note / Legal Analysis. And we try hard to always use that, albeit long, when teaching this area at BPP, because only by giving it that full title do you remember how many components there are to this skills exam. And you're taken through each of those stages within the time. So there's a first 10 minutes where candidates are given the papers and they have preparation time. For these oral skills exams, you are in a live environment. You're given the paper in hard copy. So you have a paper version of this assessment paper. You have a pack of stationery that comes from the SRA, which includes a pen, a highlighter, spare paper and a calculator, and that's it. So you have the hard copy paper, those items of stationery, and 10 minutes with the paper. You then move in to the next stage of the assessment, which is the oral performance. You have 25 minutes in which you're in a room with your client, with an actor who is playing your client, and that's your opportunity to conduct the interview. You're assessed during that portion on your skills as an interviewer, and the assessor is the client. It's the actor who's assessing you. So you're not tested on your legal knowledge at that stage, just on your skills as an interviewer. Then in the final section of the interview, another 25-minute section, you're asked to write up your attendance note / legal analysis. And that is where you are to record the record of the interview and also record your legal analysis. And that portion of your assessment is marked by a solicitor, and it's marked for both legal knowledge and skill. So 3 portions, as Johnny said: 10 minutes preparation, 25 minutes conducting an interview, 25 minutes writing up your attendance note legal analysis. And that final portion is a handwritten piece as well. So with all that said, what Johnny's showing you now... Sorry, Johnny,
I was just about to... I've got a bit of a delay here in my line, I think. Apologies if I'm talking over you. But I just wanted to just explain the amount of reading you have to do in that 10-minute period. It's not just reading this letter you can see on the screen here. If you're having trouble seeing it, just maximize the screen, folks, or access the link from Jasmine's posting in the comments. There's 3 pages they have to read, not just this letter, but also there's a little bit of there's a will to read, a very short will on the left hand side of the screen, and then some additional information about the family background of the deceased in this situation. They've got to put quite a lot of things together to work out what questions they need to ask in the interview, and they're given instructions, aren't they, in terms of what they need to achieve. So what in this assessment, what were the 3 things that they needed to achieve?
I think those 3 things are listed on the screen before. If you go back one step, Johnny, the first piece that you showed us, is an interview, is an email from a partner. And somebody had asked that question about how realistic are the scenarios. I think they're really realistic. I think the SQE2 does a really good job of replicating practice-based scenarios. Many of them start in this kind of way, with an email from a partner to the candidate, as though you're a junior lawyer in that firm and you're being asked to conduct some kind of client advice linked to whichever of the skills, whichever the legal areas you're testing in. So here you can see those bullet points where there are the 3 areas of interest for this client. So our advice, as I'm sure these students would say in the room, our advice would be to use that as your loose structure for your interview, to spend your 10 minutes planning around those themes. What do you need to know in order to be able to advise on them? And what areas of law are you anticipating you might need to explain to the client in order to make the interview flow, in order to build trust and confidence with the client in that interview scenario? Then you move in to conduct that interview based on your preparation, and then you move on finally to write it up, not just the attendance note, which in a classic law firm sense would be just recording what had been said or what had been discussed during the interview, but also including the legal advice, because of course you've got that slight eye on the fact that you are in an assessment environment and you want to be demonstrating your legal knowledge in that advice so that you can gather as many marks as possible for demonstrating that knowledge.
Yeah, and those 3 areas, 3 questions are: who should act as the executors, how should the estate be distributed, and would any inheritance tax be payable? That's quite interesting. If I could bring in the students here, because although I'm not going to ask you to give an answer to the question now, and that wouldn't be fair to put you on the spot, those are sorts of questions that we did come across on SQE1, surely. I remember looking at a question very recently on the sample questions for the SRA, and they gave you a scenario and said, well, who should be the executor? So does it give you confidence when you come to the SQE2 workshops that we deliver at BPP, but also the exams, that you've got the law already? Maybe I could start off with Maddie.
Yeah, I think one of the benefits of the SQE2 is that we do already have the knowledge, and it's more about just refreshing that knowledge rather than starting from scratch. I think what I found is that actually doing the skills and revising that way by like actively writing a letter of advice or whatever skill you want to practice helps it embed it in your brain more so than the SQE1 as well. So actually going into the SQE2 exams, I'm not as worried about the content because I know that it's in there. And as well, like you don't need to reel off every single thing about the law or wills and probate that you know. As long as you've included something that's relevant and you've answered the question, you're going to pick up some marks.
Yeah, and those questions look so like an SQE multiple choice question fact pattern in terms of the sort of things that get tested, but obviously in much more succinct style in SQE1. Okay, so what are the challenges when answering a question like this? If I could bring in maybe either Jasmine or Daria, what are the challenges where you've got some instructions, you've got a will, and then some additional information? What do you personally think the challenges would be in trying to get to the right answer here?
I personally tend to find that what strikes me and scares me the most is the sheer length of the documents you receive. So in this case, the document itself is 17 pages, but the majority of that information goes to the actor playing the client. But you will see, particularly with the skill of legal research, that sometimes you'll get a document that's 20 to 30 pages long, and all of those pages, well, ideally should be at least scanned by you, and then it's up to you to decide what's relevant and what isn't relevant and shouldn't be included in your response. And I think every single time I open one of the applied tasks we do for classes, particularly when we had the self-assessed formatives and we had to do these under timed conditions, your first thought is, well, I can't even possibly read all of this in the allotted amount of time, never mind plan an answer, write it, and proofread it. But you find that with practice, you start to be able to scan the documents a lot more effectively and actually pick out the bits of information that are relevant. And I remember in the first week of workshops, I really struggled because I would include facts that weren't necessarily relevant to the response. And then by the fourth week, I think you become a little bit more reckless just because you get used to the time pressures. And so you're much faster to like throw out the window the irrelevant fact patterns and pieces of law that are given to you. So that was definitely a challenge, but it definitely rapidly improves, I think.
Yeah, you're right. I think as a practicing lawyer for quite a few years, and I'm sure Laura might echo this. I think you learn how to filter out the irrelevant stuff quite quickly, and that comes with practice. And so the more practice you have, that's really reassuring to know that by week 4, what you thought was really daunting became something that was more manageable because you start to develop the skills to tackle it, which is what we're looking to achieve, of course, when it comes to teaching SQE2.
Could I add to that as well? I agree with
Sure.
everything that that Daria said and that you said, Johnny. I would also add that sometimes you might be surprised by what the question is actually asking you, and it might not be the question that you might have deduced from the materials. So, it's often the case that there's a lot more material, not even just in the legal research one, but across all the exams, that the question might actually be a lot narrower than the information that you've been given. So I think it's really important to make sure you understand the question you're being asked before you waste any time writing about something that's not relevant.
Yeah, and I think the feedback from the students, I would echo this to everyone on this call now, is that preparing for the SQE is not a walk in the park. Even SQE2, which has got a higher pass rate, you still have to put in the hours and get trained by a reputable provider who will get you ready for the assessment. It's very hard to do this on your own without much experience in practice. So really do seriously consider how you are going to prepare for all aspects of the SQE, because the more time you invest, the better prospects you'll have of passing what are obviously very challenging assessments. Well, we're getting through to the end part of the session. There were 3 final questions here that we could probably have a look at. Maybe take the middle one from the student from Leicester University first. What would be your best piece of advice for completing the SQE2 exams? I appreciate you haven't done the exams yet, but so far with your journey on the course panel, what would your best advice be for maybe people who are maybe going to start an SQE2 course shortly? What do you now know, now you're on SQE2, that would be helpful to share with people who are in the next step of the ladder? Maybe start off with Daria and then go on to Maddie.
Do you mind if I get a minute to think about this one, actually?
I will ask Maddie first then.
I think my best piece of advice would be, when you first look at one of the practice exam questions, don't panic. Don't think I could never do this in a million years, because I think even just after 4 workshops, if I had to draw a graph of my progress, it would literally be like the steepest line ever, because you do just pick up the skills so much easier than you think you would. So I think it's just, don't panic. You've got so long, well, a couple of months until the actual exams, and just try your best to get the most out of the sessions that you have with your tutors and try and get as much feedback as possible. But yeah, that'd be my main piece of advice.
Cool. Daria, you...
Yeah, so I just tried to reflect on what I realized as a result of taking the course. And I think for me, the biggest realization has always come down to the functioning legal knowledge, because that always scares me the most. And I felt a lot less confident with the SQE content just because of the sheer weight and volume of it. But what I've come to realize from the sample questions, and particularly because BPP gives us so many additional sample questions that follow what the SRA has given them, that a lot of the time when you read a question, you think, well, I don't remember the exact provisions or the details of the law in the subject area. All you really have to do is scroll. And so often an excerpt of the law is actually provided. Most often this is with things like the civil procedure rules or the criminal procedure rules, which are very detailed. And reading the question, you would assume that you're demanded to know this information, be able to recount it from memory. That's usually not the case. And so it was a very pleasant surprise time and time again that sometimes bits of black letter law would be inserted into the sample questions. And so my advice would be to please make sure you don't miss any pages before you start writing your response.
Yeah, that's a good point, because you're not meant to learn the civil procedure rules. They are, thousands of pages, well, over 1,000 pages long. It's just not going to happen. So giving you an extract is the only fair thing. And in practice, of course, you'd have them as an accessible piece of a resource for you to consult anyway. Great stuff. Laura, can we come on to you just to tackle the question for LPC students? So I mentioned this earlier, that LPC students might decide to cross-qualify if they can't get a training contract. So this could be an LPC graduate listening at the moment who's going to take SQE2, and they're wondering what this University of Birmingham student is saying is that, having done it, how different is the SQE2 in terms of the resources and exams and assessments compared to the LPC skills modules? Are there any gaps, for example?
Yeah, we've had a lot of students come to us through this route. We offer a program that teaches just to SQE2, which isn't what anybody in the room is studying, but it suits LPC graduates very well. And what students tell me time and again is the real challenge for LPC graduates is the breadth of legal knowledge, particularly if you've done your LPC some time ago. Often they are the students that have been in the workplace. They often have their QWE accrued since their LPC, but they need to pass SQE2 and therefore get all of that legal knowledge up to the SQE standards, which is quite a challenge. Wills in particular is an area where the depth required is very different than what was included, certainly on our LPC. So I think that's the challenge. Of course, you come with skills teaching under your belt that lots of students don't have. So there are, as we were saying earlier on, pros and cons to different approaches. But I think the knowledge is part of the challenge for LPC graduates.
Great stuff. And if we could just have one last question to Jasmine. Have you got any tips at all for students who are embarking on SQE2 from your experience now? What do you now know that you wish you'd known before, or you can share with the audience?
Yeah, I mean, as I was saying at the start, I think it's really about practice. And so I think really kind of throwing yourself into, practicing the skills, as others were saying, making the most of your tutors, and just really also reflecting on the work that you've done and how you can improve, and also what went well and what you can build on. So I think just, really throwing yourself into it and being engaged right from the start and sort of getting the maximum out of the time that you've got to prepare.
Brilliant. And it just occurred to me we hadn't answered the King's College students question at the end, Laura. Just want to take that briefly. Is it possible to prepare for SQE2?
Definitely it is. We offer a lot of courses at BPP, things like the ability to conduct a practice interview in Teams. It is now something that does make it possible to prepare virtually. I think it's worth remembering the style of the exams when you choose how you're going to study. The oral skills are face-to-face, so you will want to create some opportunities for yourself to practice in a room with somebody, but it may be that that's something you do with a friend, with a colleague, alongside study, which is online. So I think that's the one thing to bear in mind, but of course it makes it a lot more flexible, particularly if you're interested in juggling work and SQE. It may be that online study facilitates that. I think we've lost Johnny. Erin, is that time for us to move?
Yeah, I think that's perfect timing to end the session here anyway. Hopefully Johnny can join us all in the networking. But yeah, thank you so much for your discussion, everyone. As mentioned at the beginning, do check out our SQE facts page if you have any questions about the SQE more generally, as we have dozens of questions with answers written by BPP SQE experts covering a wide range of different topics. But as was just mentioned, the event isn't over yet. We still have an hour of networking for you to ask your questions to the BPP team. So for the speakers, you'll need to click the blue return button at the bottom of your page, and that will direct you to the front of the event where you'll be able to join the virtual expo. For those of you in the audience, you'll need to click Expo on the left-hand side of your page. Once you're in Expo, click on BPP's banner to enter the booth. We'd recommend sharing your audio and video during the networking so you can ask your questions directly to the speakers. And then once your question has been answered, it would be great if you could come down off screen to let other students ask their questions and make sure the session runs smoothly. As mentioned at the beginning, if you have any questions about the SQE, don't forget to check out our SQE facts page. And thank you everyone for attending today's session, and we hope to see you at future events very soon.